Krogath, a name whispered in fear across entire galaxies. His reputation was legendary, an unstoppable force of nature. Standing at nearly 10 feet tall, his 4 muscular arms were weapons in themselves, each one capable of crushing enemies or wielding deadly alien weapons. His body was a fortress of scars and hardened muscle, built from years of surviving the bloodiest arenas. Krogath wasn't just another gladiator, he was a champion, undefeated, his every victory a testament to the strength of his people, the Turax. The Turax valued one thing above all: power. In their culture, strength was everything, and failure was the ultimate disgrace. Their society was as cold and unfeeling as the void between stars. Weakness wasn't pitted, it was purged. Those who couldn't keep up, who faltered, were abandoned without a second thought. To the Turax, usefulness was the only currency, and Krogath had always been rich in it. He had been their symbol, their greatest warrior. But this worship came with a price. As long as he won, he was revered. The moment he showed weakness, that adoration would vanish as quickly as it came. For years, Krogath had never considered failure. His body, honed through countless battles, was the pinnacle of physical perfection. His victories were celebrated with the same ruthlessness that his people prized. There was no room for empathy, no time for camaraderie, only the endless pursuit of dominance. The Turax watched from their cold, metallic cities, eyes gleaming with pride whenever Krogath emerged from the blood-soaked arenas. But their pride was fleeting, conditional. They revered strength, not the warrior. And Krogath knew this better than anyone. The arena was colossal, its towering walls designed to dwarf even the most massive combatants. The stands, filled with thousands of spectators, vibrated with a tense, hungry energy. Their eyes, cold and emotionless, were fixed on the center, where Krogath stood. For him, this was routine, just another fight, just another opponent to crush. His armor gleamed in the harsh artificial light, his hands flexing as he anticipated the battle. His opponent, however, was unlike any Krogath had faced before. A new challenger, shrouded in mystery. Smaller than Krogath but unnervingly agile, darting around the arena with speed that made even the seasoned warrior hesitate. From the first blow, Krogath realized he had underestimated his foe. Each strike the challenger landed was precise, calculated, while Krogath's powerful swings missed by mere inches. The crowd remained silent, their eyes wide as they sensed the tide turning. Krogath's mind raced. How could this be happening? He had never struggled like this. His strength, his size, had always been enough to overwhelm his enemies. But not this time. The mysterious challenger was relentless, moving faster than Krogath could keep up. His massive arms, once symbols of unstoppable power, were now a liability, too slow to block the barrage of attacks. And then, the moment came. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the arena as Krogath's knee gave out under a devastating blow. Pain shot through his leg, something he hadn't felt in years. He stumbled, barely keeping himself upright. But the next strike came too fast. It hit him square in the jaw, and for the first time, Krogath, the undefeated, was sent crashing to the ground. The arena floor shook as his massive body hit the dust. Silence fell over the crowd. He lay there, disoriented, his vision blurry. The once mighty gladiator broken. His opponent stood over him for a moment before disappearing into the shadows, leaving Krogath to face the weight of his defeat alone. The pain in his leg was nothing compared to the humiliation that surged through him. He had never fallen before. He had never been the one lying in the dirt, beaten and discarded. His reign as champion was over, shattered in an instant. Krogath's body ached, but the real wound was deeper. The silence from the crowd was deafening. He tried to lift himself, but his limbs refused to cooperate. Blood dripped from his split lip, pooling beneath him. He scanned the stands, searching for the faces of his people, expecting, no, needing, some sign that they would come for him, help him to his feet, as they had after every victory. But there was nothing. The Turax, those cold, expressionless faces, stared down at him with indifference. There was no anger, no disgust, no concern. Just nothing. Their champion, their symbol of strength, was no longer useful to them. Krogath was broken, and in the eyes of the Turax, that meant he was finished. He was no longer the warrior they revered. He was just another failed experiment in the pursuit of power. The realization hit him harder than any blow his opponent had delivered. His people, the ones he had fought for, bled for, had turned their backs on him without a second thought. Not a single Turax made a move to help. One by one they stood, turning away from the spectacle of his defeat. To them, Krogath was no longer worth their time. His usefulness had ended the moment he hit the ground. In their eyes he was already dead. As his vision blurred and the arena began to spin, Krogath felt a cold emptiness settle over him. The pain in his leg, the blood in his mouth, none of it mattered anymore. What hurt most was the abandonment. He had given everything to his people, and now they discarded him like a broken tool. Alone in the dust, the once mighty Gladiator lay in silence, left to die by the only family he had ever known. Captain Ava Reynolds stood at the head of her ragtag group of rebels, scanning the desolate terrain outside the arena. A battle had recently torn through the area, and the rebels were here to scavenge. They had no other choice. Their resources were dwindling, and every scrap, every piece of salvaged equipment, could mean the difference between life and death. Ava had been fighting this war for years, ever since the Galactic Dominion tightened its grip on Earth and countless other planets. Their rebellion was small, barely a blip on the Dominion's radar, but they survived through sheer determination. Beside her was Dr. Elara Foster, the group's medic and engineer. Brilliant and resourceful, she was as much a leader as Ava in her own way, keeping the rebels alive with her ingenuity. Despite the dire circumstances, the group was more than just a band of fighters. They were a family. They trusted each other with their lives, and that loyalty was their greatest strength. Where the Dominion ruled with fear and oppression, the rebels held fast to their belief in something bigger, each other. They had built their base in the forgotten tunnels of a distant planet, always one step ahead of the Dominion's forces. Scavenging missions like this one were routine, but today, they found something they didn't expect. Ava led her team through the aftermath of the arena battle, picking through wreckage and debris. At first, it was just the usual: broken weapons, tattered armor, nothing of significant use. Then they saw him. Lying motionless, half buried in dust and blood, was Krogath. His immense size was unmistakable. His body, though broken, still radiated a menacing presence, even in defeat. The rebels froze, recognizing him immediately. Krogath, the famed gladiator, the embodiment of the brutality they fought against. His name alone sent chills down their spines. He had fought for the Dominion's amusement, a warrior who had crushed countless enemies in the name of strength. For a moment, no one spoke. The group exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Krogath was their enemy, wasn't he? A symbol of everything they hated, everything they had sworn to resist. He was one of the strong who oppressed the weak, a tool of the very empire they were trying to dismantle. "He's a monster," one of the rebels muttered. "We should leave him." Ava stood silently, weighing the decision. It would be easy to turn her back on him, to leave him to die in the dirt. After all, what had Krogath ever done but fight for the side of power? He was an enemy in every sense of the word. But something made her hesitate. She knew what the easy choice was, but it didn't sit right with her. Dr. Elara spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "If we leave him, we're no better than the Dominion. If we let him die just because of what he represents, we've lost something more important than this war." Ava looked at her, conflicted. Elara was right. Their entire fight wasn't just about survival. It was about holding on to their humanity, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. They couldn't allow themselves to become as ruthless as their enemies. But saving Krogath? That was a risk. "He might kill us the moment he wakes up," Ava said. "Maybe," Elara admitted. "But maybe he won't. We have to try." The group remained divided, some wanting to leave Krogath to his fate, others agreeing with Elara's plea for compassion. In the end, Ava made the call. They wouldn't abandon him. They would save Krogath, if for no other reason than because they were human, and they didn't leave people to die, no matter who they were. They worked quickly, moving Krogath's massive frame with care. Even in his weakened state, the Gladiator was intimidating. It took all of them to lift him onto a makeshift stretcher and carry him back to their base, the strain evident in every step. Ava kept her guard up, her hand never straying far from her weapon, just in case he woke and lashed out. But he remained unconscious, his breath shallow, as they made the long trek back. Krogath drifted in and out of awareness, his mind clouded by pain and confusion. He could feel hands lifting him, could hear voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. For a moment, he thought the Turaks had come for him after all, that they were taking him to heal, to fight again. But as his eyes fluttered open, he saw unfamiliar faces. Humans. It made no sense. Why would humans, weak and insignificant in the eyes of his people, help him? The Turaks wouldn't have. If anything, they would have left him to rot. That's how it was. Once you were broken, you were nothing. He had lived his entire life believing that, and now these fragile creatures were trying to save him. It was absurd. His body screamed with pain, but his mind was filled with suspicion and anger. He couldn't trust them. His entire life had been a lesson in survival, and survival meant showing no weakness. These humans were weak, yet they acted as if they were doing him a favor. He resented it, even as his body betrayed him, too broken to resist. In their underground base, Dr. Alara worked tirelessly, using every resource she had to keep Krogath alive. Her hands moved with precision, patching his wounds, stabilizing his vitals. She was both doctor and mechanic, using a mix of scavenge tech and medical knowledge to heal the alien warrior. Krogath watched her through half-lidded eyes, too weak to speak, too angry to show gratitude. His pride had been shattered in the arena, and now these humans were the ones deciding his fate. Every time Alara approached, Krogath tensed. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to lash out, but his body refused to cooperate. He had always been in control, always been the strongest, and now he was helpless, dependent on these tiny, fragile beings. It enraged him. Days passed. Alara worked without rest, patching Krogath's wounds and monitoring his progress. The rebels, though wary, continued to bring supplies and support the doctor's efforts. Ava, ever pragmatic, kept a close eye on the situation, her trust in Krogath far from earned. They knew who he was and what he had done, but they hadn't abandoned him. Not yet. As Krogath's body began to heal, so did his mind, though it was a slow and bitter process. He couldn't understand why they would bother to help him. His entire existence had been based on strength, on using power to dominate and survive. These humans, by every measure he had been taught, were weak. Yet they had saved him. It didn't make sense, and that unsettled him more than any injury. When Krogath finally woke fully, his mind clear for the first time since the battle, he was met with a sight that confounded him. Alara sat beside him, checking his vitals, her movements careful and deliberate. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation in her actions. She was helping him, not for gain, not for glory, but because it was simply who she was. For the first time in his life, Krogath felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude? Confusion? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that these humans had shown him a kindness that his own people never would have. And as he lay there, recovering, he began to question everything he had ever believed. Krogath's recovery was agonizingly slow. Every breath was a reminder of his broken body, a far cry from the indomitable force he once was. The humans, however, never wavered. Each day, they tended to him with a consistency he found perplexing. Dr. Alara was always there, checking his wounds, adjusting the treatments, her hands moving with care that was both alien and unsettling to him. The others, though wary, brought supplies and food, sometimes even speaking to him in words he barely understood. It was as if they cared whether he lived or died, a concept Krogath had never experienced before. He watched them, his suspicion lingering. Why would they help him? It didn't make sense. In Turak's society, weakness was a death sentence. His people would never have wasted their time on a fallen warrior. And yet, these humans seemed to act out of something else, something he couldn't quite grasp. Compassion? It was a word he had heard before, but it had never meant anything in his life. Still, there was no denying that their actions were driven by something other than gain. As the days passed, Krogatha's sharp mind began to notice patterns. The humans worked together in a way he had never seen among his own kind. They shared their food without hesitation, helped each other with tasks, and their interactions were filled with a quiet sense of trust. It was foreign to him. In the arena, every action had been a calculated move for survival, every alliance temporary and driven by necessity. But here, these humans seemed to rely on each other, not out of obligation, but something deeper. It unsettled him, this concept of mutual care, but it also intrigued him in ways he couldn't deny. Krogath lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the small room they had given him. His mind wandered to memories of his life as a champion. The roars of the crowd, the praise of his people, it had all been conditional. The moment he fell, the moment he showed the slightest hint of weakness, he had been discarded. His entire existence had been a solitary one, driven by a singular purpose, to remain undefeated. Now those cheers felt hollow, their praise meaningless. His people had loved him for what he could do, not for who he was. The humans, by contrast, were different. They weren't fighting for individual glory or survival, they fought for each other. He saw it every day in how they worked together, how they shared the meager resources they had scavenged. The more he observed them, the more it became clear that they were driven by something far more enduring than the pursuit of strength. They fought not just to live, but to ensure that no one was left behind. It was the antithesis of everything Krogath had been taught. Could strength really lie in something other than raw power? His thoughts were haunted by flashbacks of the arena. He had been a god among warriors, but only as long as he stood undefeated. Once he fell, his people had shown their true colors. They had turned their backs on him without hesitation. The Turak's way had always been clear, strength or death. He had lived by it, and he had fallen by it. But now, lying here, surrounded by these fragile creatures, Krogath found himself questioning everything. What if strength wasn't just about physical power? What if there was something more? Something deeper? The more time passed, the more Krogath realized that he was at a crossroads. His body was healing, but his mind was torn. The humans had offered him a place among them, a chance to join their cause. But his pride as a Turak's warrior resisted the idea. How could he, Krogath the Unbreakable, align himself with beings he had always considered weak? The very thought felt like a betrayal of everything he had stood for. And yet, they had saved him. They had shown him a kind of strength he had never known before, one that wasn't about dominance or survival at all costs. Captain Ava noticed his growing distance, his reluctance to integrate. One evening, she confronted him directly. "Why do you keep pulling away from us?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. "We saved you. We've done everything we can to help you, but you still act like you're alone." Krogath met her gaze, his jaw clenched. "I am alone. I've always been alone. That's how I survive." "That's not survival," Ava said. "That's isolation. You're not with the Turaks anymore. We don't abandon people here." Her words stung. Krogath had lived his whole life by a code of strength, but standing before him was a human who challenged everything he believed. "You talk about strength like it's something other than power. But in the end, power is all that matters. The moment you lose it, you're discarded." Ava shook her head, her expression hardening. "That's not strength. It's fear. You're afraid to trust anyone because your people taught you that trust is weakness. But look around. We've risked our lives to save each other, to save you. If that's not strength, then what is?" Krogath didn't respond immediately. He had no answer. His whole life had been built on the idea that strength was solitary, that power was the only way to survive. But these humans, they weren't just surviving. They were living. They fought together, they trusted each other, and they protected one another, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It wasn't the kind of strength he had known, but it was undeniable. As Ava left him standing there, Krogath found himself at war with his own beliefs. The humans' loyalty to one another, their willingness to fight for each other, was a kind of strength he had never valued. But now, in the quiet of their underground base, he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. The Galactic Dominion had found them. The alarms blared through the underground base as Ava and her team scrambled into action. There was no time for second-guessing. They had known this day would come, and now, it was upon them. The rebels were vastly outnumbered, the Dominion's forces closing in fast, their strength overwhelming. But the humans moved with a kind of calm determination, preparing for what was likely to be their final stand. Krogath watched from the shadows, his gaze fixed on the flurry of activity around him. They knew the odds were against them, and yet not one of them showed fear. Ava issued orders with a steady hand, while the others gathered weapons and reinforced their fragile defenses. They weren't just preparing to fight for their own survival. They were preparing to fight for each other, for their cause, for the chance at something greater. The Dominion's forces, with their advanced technology and sheer numbers, would be upon them within minutes. The ground above was already trembling with the approach of the enemy. Krogath's instincts screamed at him to retreat, to revert to the survivalism that had been burned into his soul since birth. He could leave now, slip away into the chaos, and no one would stop him. He owed these humans nothing. Yet, as he looked at them, standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to face certain death, something held him back. This was the moment. The decision he had been avoiding since the day they had saved him. Would he fight alongside them, or would he fall back into the cold isolation that had defined him for so long? The question weighed heavy in his mind, and for the first time in his life, Krogath wasn't sure what the right choice was. The first shots were fired. The Dominion forces breached the outer perimeter, and the base shook with the impact of heavy artillery. The rebels sprang into action, meeting the enemy with everything they had. Krogath watched as the battle unfolded, his mind racing, torn between what he had been and what he might become. Then he saw her, Dr. Ilara, the woman who had saved his life, the one who had treated him with kindness when he didn't deserve it. She was pinned down, caught in the crossfire, struggling to hold her position as the enemy closed in. Her face, usually so calm and composed, now reflected the desperation of the situation. A blast hit the wall near her, sending debris crashing down. She was running out of time. In that instant, something inside Krogath shifted. It wasn't a gradual change but a sudden, overwhelming realization. These humans, fragile and small as they were, had a strength that went beyond anything he had ever known. Their strength wasn't in their bodies, but in their unity, their willingness to protect each other, even in the face of overwhelming odds. They didn't fight for glory or survival alone, they fought for each other. Before he could think, Krogath moved. His body, still not fully healed, roared in protest as he grabbed the nearest weapon, a human rifle unfamiliar in his hands, and charged into the fray. The Dominion soldiers, focused on the humans, didn't expect to see a towering alien gladiator coming at them full force. Krogath barreled through their ranks, using his size and strength to tear apart their defenses, his presence like a storm on the battlefield. The rebels, seeing Krogath fight, were momentarily stunned. But then, something shifted in them too. They rallied around him, their morale lifting as they pushed back with renewed vigor. Krogath was a force of nature, his combat skills honed in the arenas of his past now turned against the Dominion. Every blow he struck sent shockwaves through the enemy's lines, and soon, the tide of battle began to turn. He fought not as a gladiator fighting for survival, but as something else, something new. He fought for Ilara, for Ava, for these humans who had shown him a different way to live. With every swing of his fists, with every shot fired, Krogath tore through the enemy, clearing a path for the rebels to push forward. The battle raged on, fierce and unrelenting, but for the first time, Krogath felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with himself. The battle was long and brutal, but in the end, the rebels stood victorious. The Dominion forces, unable to break through the rebel defenses, retreated, leaving the survivors to regroup in the aftermath. The price of victory had been high, many lives had been lost, and the base lay in ruins. But they had survived, and in no small part because of Krogatha's decision to stand with them. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Krogath stood among the survivors, his body battered and bruised, but still standing. He looked around at the faces of those who remained, at Ava and Ilara, at the humans who had fought beside him. And for the first time in his life, he understood what true strength was. It wasn't about individual power or dominance. It wasn't about surviving alone. It was about standing together, fighting for something greater than oneself. Captain Ava approached him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She didn't say much, just offered a nod of gratitude, but Krogath understood. He wasn't just a stranger to them anymore. He was one of them. He had earned his place among the rebels, not through brute force, but through the choice he had made to fight for something beyond his own survival. In the days that followed, the rebels began to rebuild. Their losses were heavy, but their spirits were unbroken. Krogath, once an outsider, found himself integrated into their ranks. He trained with them, learned their ways, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of belonging. He was no longer Krogath the Gladiator, the isolated warrior who fought only for himself. He was Krogath, a part of something bigger, a warrior fighting for a cause. As the sun set on their makeshift camp one evening, Krogath stood beside Ava, looking out at the horizon. The Dominion would come again, stronger next time. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, Krogath didn't feel alone. He was part of something now, something worth fighting for. Ava glanced at him, her voice quiet but resolute. "We still have a long way to go." Krogath nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Yes," he said slowly, "but now we fight together." And in that moment Krogath knew that he had found his true strength, not in the arenas of the Turax, but here, among these humans, fighting for something far greater than himself. He was no longer just a gladiator. He was a warrior with a purpose. And he would fight with everything he had to see that purpose fulfilled.